Okay, so in this game played between Larry Evans and Leonid Shamkovich in 1980, I have decided to take it from this particular position just to show how tactics can be used, not necessarily to, win a piece or pawn even or anything like this, or for some crushing attack, but can instead simply be used for achieving some kind of strategic benefit. In this case, obtaining the better minor piece against the inferior minor piece, in this case the good bishop versus bad bishop situation. So let's take a look at what is meant by that. In this perfectly acceptable position for white, it's an open Sicilian structure, there's a lot of attacking possibilities. White makes a bit of an error. He should have perhaps played some move like queen to d3 and kept the balance with all to play for, but instead he played this move bishop to d3. Can you spot what is the actual problem with this move? Okay, so the move is knight to h5. And the point is that when the queen retreated, now Leonid Shamkovich played knight takes f4, grabbing a pawn. Now white is compelled to recapture the knight on f4 and now e5. Striking a double attack here on the queen and the bishop. And after queen to f2, e takes d4, queen takes d4, black has, I would say, 4/5 of the way there to having a superior bishop versus an inferior bishop position on the board. Now you might be asking why I am saying this when we have a situation of two bishops against a bishop and a knight. Well, the problem from a white perspective is that it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve what he would like, which is to exchange this light squared bishop for this light squared bishop and then have a knight versus bishop situation where the knight is quite effective. But after black's next move, queen to a5, bishop to b5 possibilities are not available. And the problem is that for now, black, with the use of combining his bishop pair with the queen, well, there may be some attacking possibilities, and also this knight on c3 is not an especially useful piece. It doesn't have many prospects other than to jump right in onto the d5 square. If, for example, white tried a move such as bishop to c4, he would get into immediate trouble following the move pawn to d5. And the point is, suddenly that unopposed dark squared bishop is causing a lot of damage, the king and the queen here on this diagonal. And after bishop takes d5, bishop c5 would just be winning the game. So therefore, what I'm trying to get across is that right now it's not a good bishop versus bad bishop situation, but it is a bishop pair versus bishop and knight situation, and white finds what is objectively likely the best move, which is knight to d5, activating the knight, centralizing it, and compelling black to give up his bishop pair. But once this occurs, it's a fair strategic exchange. But after queen takes, e takes d5, now we see a battle of opposite colored bishops. And what's important to just keep in mind straight off the bat is that the black bishop is superior here. So let's try and understand why that might be the case. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is this situation here, in my opinion, on d5 and d6. This pawn on d5, it's not the same as what we said before, which is, space is usually an advantage. We talked about this in the last game that we showed, not within this section, but rather when we were discussing bishops of the same color, how having a space advantage is usually a good thing. Now here, in particular, this space advantage created by the pawn on d5 is harmful for white. The reason why this is because the white bishop is not able to affect the game along these two diagonals because this pawn is here on d5. White would nearly prefer not to have this pawn at all. Can you imagine how much better the position would be for white if his bishop was on that square? But because this pawn is A, on that square, and B, locked to that square, then there's no way for white to correct this unless black allows him by, giving up this pawn on d6, which black will not do. On the other hand, black's bishop can find an excellent outpost, Can you see where black will wish to take his bishop? So, of course, the square is e5. Black will at some point play that bishop onto e5, and from there, it will be targeting both the king and the queen side. And so the structure here in the center enables black to have a more influential bishop. And not only a more influential bishop, but also a more stable bishop. This is an outpost, whereas white simply does not have any good square. Here would not be an especially effective square, as the bishop would just be biting on granite. Now, in addition to this, black immediately plays the move f5, which deprives white of that square on e4, but most importantly, it's preparing the bishop's route to f6. Now, we need to be a little bit careful as black that this e6 square is not a problem. Let's say after rook a to e1, white may post the rook on e6. However, in this case, after bishop to f6, note that the pawn on b2 is in danger, and so white may not wish to play rook to e6 and part with this pawn. And even if he did wish to do this, he also needs to be worried about bishop to e5, because this rook may not play much of a role here on e6. It sort of looks good, but it's actually trapped, and black will happily play around it. He will post his king maybe on f7 at some point, or perhaps he will simply challenge the rook and perhaps get the rooks off the board. So yeah, this is the only concern, but it's a very minor concern. Here, as mentioned already, black is intending on playing bishop to f6, which will target this pawn on b2. Now, it's a tough decision as always. Do you post the pawns on the dark squares like this on c3 and b2? On the one hand, this will keep this bishop a little bit more at bay. On the other, in the event of, let's say, c3, bishop to f6, black can at some point try to create a minority attack on the queen side and break down this structure and maybe win a pawn in the process. So this was a concern for white, and the other concern is that this pawn on d5 is not going to be easily defended. If you set up your pawns on c3 and b2, then it's not the same as if you set up your pawns on c4 and b3, where you have this entire pawn chain. And so we can say that white has a lot of complex structural problems to try and resolve, and black, on the other hand, doesn't have these problems, partly because his structure is a little bit more compact. Here on the king side, yes, white is crashing down with his bishop, but for white, if he sets up his pawns like this, his structure, his queenside structure, can be viewed as these four pawns. And we notice that if he sets up his pawns like this, like he might wish to do on c3 and on b2, just highlighting these two key pawns that are on dark squares, this would be the equivalent of this, roughly speaking, because we have the white bishop being the light squared bishop and black arranging his pawns along the light squares to try and limit the influence of this piece. And similarly, in this case, white is arranging his pawns on dark squares. However, the important detail is that if you do this, the pawn on d5 is disconnected from the remaining pawns, since you're more or less deciding this is the structure that I want to go for. So, well, okay, we can hopefully agree that although it's a little bit advanced, a little bit complicated to detect that this kind of disconnect between the white queenside pawns and its kind of equivalent, which might be these kingside pawns, in spite of it being a little bit advanced, hopefully the point is more or less clear and we can move back to the actual game itself. So black played the move f5, and white instead decided, perhaps he should have played c3 regardless, but he decided not to go for this and instead go for b3. And by playing in this way, after bishop to f6, rook 8 e1, bishop d4 check, king h1, bishop e5, and now c4, white basically had a choice between posting his pawns on dark squares, which would blunt the influence of this bishop, or posting his pawns like this on light squares, which would sort of sidestep or aim to sidestep this bishop. I mean, the pawns can no longer be targeted by the enemy's bishop, and furthermore connected pawns since they're all in the same diagonal. The a2 pawn supports b3, that supports c4 and in turn supports d5. However, the price to pay is that on the one hand they are not targets, but on the other the dark squares now are extremely weak on the queen side, and therefore at some point the black king may even invade on the queen side. You never know in an endgame. As rooks come off the board, we may wish the king to go hunting for the pawns. It's relatively unlikely, of course, but nevertheless it's something to consider. The more likely possibility is that black at some point will play a5, a4, now that he has this target here on b3. And after exchange, then the black rook will enter either to a2 or possibly to a1. But as it enters along the 7th rank, one of the things that is very important is this influence of the bishop controlling that a1 square. Therefore, if ever these pawns come off the board, black is going to dominate on the a file, and that will be another point of entry into the position potential concern. So therefore, white has some queenside problems, and his pawns are also more or less easily fixable along the light squares. In other words, black is so dominant on the dark squares that white will never really be able to advance with b4, c5. The a1 square, as mentioned. Another detail that is important is this bishop has no point of support. And perhaps worth mentioning also is that by virtue of the combination of this well-supported pawn on f5 and the bishop on e5, the black king can enter the game, can activate and centralize much more effectively, much more easily than the white king. For instance, if black plays king g7, he is perfectly safe. Even if he were to play king f7, such a move could be considered. It would be unwise, but it could nevertheless be considered. Whereas if white tries king g1, black could even check him and force him right back to h1 in this given instance. So the activity of the bishop is having an influence on the queenside prospects, especially along the a file. Also, the queenside prospects in terms of mobilizing this majority is very, very difficult as a result of superior bishop and king centralization. Black indeed played the move b6. So the general rule here is that you shouldn't put your pawns on dark squares. However, in this case, the move is very logical because it's aimed at preventing an undermining of the d6 pawn, which is very, very important pawn, because if black did absolutely nothing, let's say he played the move king to g7, white could in fact consider this move c5 for tactical reasons. The point being, after d takes c5, rook takes bishop, the bishop is undefended. And if black, let's say, responds with a move such as rook to c8, and white were to even capture on d6, the concern is that after bishop takes d6, this bishop has lost its anchor, and the bishop on d3, though still without any kind of anchor, may be able to post itself on c4, and that would tie the black bishop down to d6, because at some point, if the bishop moves, d6 itself may occur, and suddenly we have an activation of this bishop. And also the bishop on c4 will prevent any kind of potential profitable activity for the black rook on c8. So we can see that this is going to trump any other concern about posting the pawns on dark squares. So black correctly plays b6. White went rook e2, and now black improves the king position. Rook f3. And now this interesting move, pawn to h5. Notice how black is happy to post his pawns on the light squares, blunting the bishop, and also black needs to be very careful about advancing his pawns on the dark squares because of the issue of being blockaded. So let's say that we play f4. Not only is this bishop's influence a little bit reduced, but also the concern is that it may be easier for white, if pawns push along the dark squares, for white to establish some kind of blockade on the light squares where he is naturally dominant. In this particular case, it is probably not so easy because g5, h5, and g4 is a difficult plan to stop regardless, since the white bishop struggles to perhaps transfer over to this diagonal. If, for instance, we could transfer this bishop to e6 and we could post the pawn on h3, then you can see how that blockade is occurring on the light square. Of course, it's not possible in this particular game, but it's important to keep in mind that you're usually seeking to advance your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop since they coordinate better in this way. White played the move King G1, and now Black played the move A5, which should not be too surprising since it's based on the same ideas that we previously discussed about the A file opening up to Black's benefit and the control of that A1 square. White played the move A4, and this is an interesting moment again. The move keeps the queen side closed, but on the other hand, it pays a big price because White loses any remaining flexibility that he had, and the pawn mobility, the potential pawn mobility, is just gone. What do I mean by this? Well, notice this pawn on B3, it's now more or less fixed for life on B3 because B4 is very, very difficult to execute since Black owns the B4 square, and C5 is going to be even more difficult since Black has it controlled with not one but two pawns. So therefore, the only way to actually maintain some possible flexibility long term would be to leave the pawn on A2 and aim for a move such as pawn to A3. The idea being that in this event, if A4, then pawn to B4, and now a couple of the pawns are posted on dark squares and the possibility of C5 becomes somewhat realistic down the line. With the move A4, what White is actually aiming to do is to play very passively and try to demonstrate that although Black has a tangible advantage here and a majority on the king side that is flexible, as you notice, this cannot be easily stopped at some point or another. And what White is trying to claim is that he will just lock up the queen side and he will defend only on the king side. Personally, I think that this is just too passive a reaction, and White should at least try and keep his options open, even if from a psychological point of view, it's tougher to play A3 and keep your pawn on a dark square where it can be targeted. Nevertheless, at least in this way, White may consider mobilizing that queenside majority, because if we notice, White has that queenside pawn majority, Black has the kingside pawn majority, and when he plays A4, he's essentially just letting go of the queenside pawn majority because it is not useful in almost any scenario as it cannot be mobilized. Notice how these 4 pawns are being stopped by Black's 3 pawns here. And in fact, only in some very, very unusual king and pawn endgame situations, which will not materialize because Black is in an advantageous position, only in those can this majority actually maybe be used by using sacrificial means to leverage the majority, with a double pawn sacrifice and then aim to promote first. But even this would be very difficult since after b4, a takes b4, this pawn would run very fast. But some of you would be familiar with these kind of king and pawn ideas, very typical sacrificial idea where at first sight there appears to be a blockade, but actually it's not a true blockade. Nevertheless, short of that kind of unusual scenario, an extremely improbable scenario for this particular game, short of that, White just has a useless extra pawn on the queen side. So anyway, after a4, Black played h4, mobilizing his pawns further, and now White went h3, trying to establish that blockade on the king side. But once again, it's very similar to establishing a blockade on the queen side, where as you post the pawns on the light squares, you are creating a huge stronghold over those light squares, huge grip, coupled with the fact that you have your minor piece here, the bishop, so you have an extra piece on the light squares, meaning that there is no way to get broken down on the light squares. But the price to pay is that you become very imbalanced and you become very weak on the dark squares, and Black is going to try and use this to his advantage. And notice that although Black has posted the queenside pawns on the dark squares, that's okay because he doesn't intend on actually mobilizing these pawns. It's very difficult, the mobility for White is eliminated owing to the control, the grip on the dark squares. Now, for Black, his mobility has been eliminated for the same fundamental reasons, but the big difference is he doesn't care. He does not care about not being able to play b5 since he's trying to make progress on the king side. And notice that on the king side, he is indeed aiming for a g5, g4 break and keeping some of his pawns on the light squares. were he to post all of his pawns on dark squares, we would get a relatively straightforward blockade for white. Black now plays rook a8. Now the rook on a8 served no purpose. King f1. Bishop to d4. The bishop improves its position further and operations begin on the e-file. White exchanges, which is in keeping with his passive strategy. He's just trying to increase the chances of holding the draw. Now white plays bishop e2, and again we arrive at an important moment. This rook on f3 is a little bit misplaced as a result of the white king landing on f1, and now the bishop therefore moves to e2 to create the possibility of rook to d3. But Shamkovich had perhaps anticipated this and played the move bishop to e3. And again the bishop demonstrates its usefulness. Here on e3 it's killing the rook on f3, and also we can now begin to see some possibilities where this king may move across and finally go after the base of the queenside pawn formation for white, which we already discussed these possibilities, I believe, in the context of an a5, a4 type break. White goes king to e1, trying to bring the king over to the queenside, king f6, and king to d1. Black plays bishop to g5, and now white plays rook to d3. Now black may have been a little bit struggling for exactly how he would continue. I suspect that his plan would have been rook to e4 and at some point king to e5 and try to make an invasion in this way, since the immediate king to e5 would fail to rook takes e3. And black certainly does not want to play f4, although the bishop would then be supported. We notice once again those pawns are on dark squares, and you really do not want to risk all of your pawns being on dark squares and consequently an easy blockade along the light squares for white. Maybe the king would post itself on c2 to hold the black king back from further progress, controlling the c3 and the d3 points. And the white bishop would take care of preventing access via g4, and the rook would attempt to trade itself for the black rook at some point, perhaps on the e or on the f file. So some kind of a strategy like this for white would make sense and give him very good chances to draw. And so the bishop moves back to g5, and in so doing, not only are rook e4 and maybe rook d4 ideas in the air, but also the immediate king e5, and then king d4 is definitely an option. White now plays rook to d3, perhaps anticipating king e5 ideas, but funnily enough, this is a big mistake. Black has tricked white, and black returns with the bishop to e3, and he pivots and is now going to move along the king side and chase here, because white has been extremely concerned for the last few moves about defending the base of his queenside pawn structure, and black now, with great flexibility, is going to take a different direction. The white king returns to the king side, king g5, and now king f1. But black has entered with the king, and notice the bishop continues to be extremely passive. As a consequence of the superior bishop, so many concessions have been made by white. So the structural concessions on the queen side, and also problems with the activity of his rook, have been the direct result of the superiority of the black bishop over the white bishop. Bishop to f3, and now with the support of the king on f4, g5 is played, still keeping a pawn on a light square. Bishop to h5, rook e7, rook to d1, and finally g4. That kingside pawn majority has been mobilized. H takes g4, f takes g4, bishop to g6, and king g3. This is really beautiful and extremely instructive. Rook to e1 and h3. Finally, black converts his extra pawn into a deadly 6th rank pawn that is soon to be on the 7th rank. White played the move rook e2, and here black played the move rook e5, and white resigned. There is simply nothing to be done against the combined threats of h2 with h1 under good circumstances. Notice it was important to place the rook on e5, because had black played the move h2 immediately, then rook to g2 check, king h3, and bishop f5 check would be a rude awakening, and the pawn would drop for black. However, rook e5 aims at covering, taking control of that f5 square, and then h2 is a deadly threat. And additionally, in some lines, black may consider posting his king somewhere on f3 or f4, and rook g5 with rook g1 ideas. So that's unlikely, but nevertheless, it's worth noting that the king, due to its passive position on the first rank, is at risk of being checkmated in certain variations. So a fantastically instructive game, in my opinion. The first of two games that we will look at with bishops of opposite color. We will now move on to the second game. For me, the big takeaways of this particular game before we do move on is the issue of a stable bishop, stable centralized bishop. It started on e5. If we return to such a position, the somewhat complex issue of the choice between a disconnected pawn structure were you to post your pawns like this, since the pawn cannot support the more advanced pawn. There was also the issue of this pawn on d5, this space advantage, being an illusory advantage, as it actually represents a disadvantage, since the pawn on d5 blocks the white light squared bishop from hitting a point of major activity, and white would actually have better holding chances, better drawing chances if this pawn was simply wiped off the board. Additionally, there is the important point that the bishop controlling the a1 square enabled some a5, a4 ideas, which actually is what led, as we move forward, is what led white to play a4. And then this is definitely a worthy point to remember, that after a4, there is no possibility to advance along the dark squares. The pawns are now fixed. The mobility has been eliminated for white, and he is effectively a pawn down because his majority cannot be mobilized, whereas black's majority absolutely can. And then the very, very instructive way in which black proceeded to mobilize that majority, keeping his pawns on light squares and patiently improving the placement of his pieces, notably his king, as well as, in fact, the bishop occupying a beautiful square on e3. But this activation of the black king and a little trick along the way, king g5, king f4, the king reaches a fantastic square, and from here, in spite of white returning with his king in order to guard g2, from here, g5, g4 could not be prevented, and that led to the creation of a passed pawn, which decided the game. So I hope you enjoyed this particular game, and I shall see you in a second for the second and last game of Bishops of Opposite Colors. So see you there.